Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep into, well, I guess you could say the heart of ABA, selection by consequences.
It sounds a little complex, but it's actually a pretty intuitive concept.
Oh yeah, definitely, once you break it down.
Yeah, it's this fundamental idea that consequences shape behavior. And we're not just talking about humans here. We're talking from how species evolve to how we learn. I mean, even new skills. It's incredible.
It's a big one. And we've got some research articles here that are really going to help us uncover how this whole idea plays out.
Yeah.
On three, well, I guess you could call them levels. They're definitely interconnected, though.
Yeah.
Evolution, individual behavior, and even culture. We're going all over the place.
And what I think is so fascinating about this concept is that it acts like this filter. You know, it's constantly shaping and refining.
Oh, interesting.
Everything from the genes that get passed down to the behaviors we learn and even the cultural practices. It's pretty powerful stuff.
Wow. It's like a ripple effect. We'll be diving into some really cool examples, too. We've got the egg-laying ritual of a marine snail.
Oh, yeah.
Carpenter ants and how they switch roles. Oh, and get this. We'll even be exploring how whistling evolved as language on a remote island.
I love that one.
As we unpack all of this, think about how these different levels of selection by consequences might show up in your work as ABA professionals.
That's a great point. Recognizing these principles in action, that can be incredibly valuable.
For sure. So let's start with what we're calling level one, evolution and natural selection. That's the foundation, right? The ground floor of how selection by consequences operates.
Exactly. It's the idea that those individuals with traits that give them a survival advantage in their environment are more likely to reproduce.
Makes sense.
And pass on those traits. So it's all about, which genes make it to the next generation.
Yeah.
Those genes and traits, they're selected because they lead to better chances of survival and reproductive success.
So it's like nature's constantly running these experiments, seeing what works and what doesn't. And the results of those experiments, they're written in the genes of the survivors.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Right. I mean, look at the dinosaurs. Their extinction after that massive asteroid impact, it's a dramatic reminder of how what works in one environment
might not work in another.
Exactly. They couldn't adapt.
The dinosaurs were adapted to very specific environmental conditions, and when those conditions changed drastically, they couldn't keep up.
Wow.
But at the same time, you had smaller mammals with different traits, being warm-blooded, adaptability. They were able to thrive in that new environment.
That makes me think about the individuals we work with. They've got their own unique strengths and challenges, just like those mammals. And figuring out what supports their success in their own specific environment, well, that's our job.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, to really get this, we need to talk about the difference between genotype and phenotype.
Okay.
So genotype, that's like the blueprint. It's the genetic code you inherit, all those instructions in your DNA. Okay, so it's like the recipe for a cake.
Exactly.
You've got all the ingredients listed out, but the final product depends on how you bake it.
Right. Perfect analogy. The phenotype, that's the actual cake. The observable traits, they result from the interaction between your genes and the environment. So even though you have, a specific genetic blueprint, the environment, it can really influence how those genes are expressed.
So our genes are the starting point, but the environment can shape the final outcome.
Okay, got it. Now, where does all this genetic variation come from in the first place? I mean, if everyone in a species had the same genes, there wouldn't be much for natural selection to act on.
You're exactly right. There are two main sources of genetic variation. The first is recombination.
Okay.
That happens during sexual reproduction. It's like shuffling a deck of cards. The genes get all mixed up and you get these new combinations in the offspring.
So each new generation gets a slightly different hand of cards, genetically speaking.
Precisely. And then there are mutations. These are those random changes in the genetic code.
Most mutations, they're either neutral or harmful. But every now and then, a mutation comes along that gives an organism an advantage.
It's like a random glitch in the code that turns into this brilliant upgrade. And those are the ones, the beneficial mutations, that are really what fuel evolution, right?
Exactly. Now let's talk about how genes influence behavior. Some behaviors, they're very tightly controlled by genes.
Okay.
And that leads to what we call behavioral rigidity, fixed action patterns. Those are a great example.
I remember those.
These are those instinctual behaviors, like a specific sequence of movements. They're triggered by a particular stimulus, and they occur in almost the same way every time.
Like that stickleback fish.
Yeah.
No matter what, if it sees something with a red underbelly,
Yeah.
it goes into attack mode, even if it's just a harmless piece of wood.
Yes, that's a classic example. And it's important to remember that we see similar fixed action patterns, or at least strong tendency, towards certain behaviors in humans as well. It's not always as straightforward as a red belly triggering aggression, but we do have certain innate predispositions.
Yeah.
And understanding this can be really helpful in ABA because it reminds us that some behaviors might be more difficult to change than others.
Yeah, it's like trying to teach that fish not to attack red things. You're going to need to get creative with your approach. But even though genes play such a big role, it's not the whole story, right? We know that learning and experience also shape behavior.
Absolutely. In fact, the capacity for learning itself, well, that's also influenced by genes. There was this fascinating experiment where researchers selectively bred blowflies based on their ability to be classically conditioned.
So they were basically breeding flies that were better learners. That's wild.
It is, and they found that the ability to learn could be passed down from one generation to the next. But here's the really interesting part. Natural selection actually favors behavioral flexibility, especially when environments are unpredictable.
Because if things are constantly changing, being able to adapt, learn new behaviors, that gives you a huge advantage.
Right.
And that's where operant and respondent conditioning come in. They allow organisms to learn and adapt throughout their lifetimes.
Exactly. Operant conditioning is about, it's about learning through the consequences of our actions, like getting a reward for doing something well, or a negative consequence if we do something we shouldn't.
Makes sense.
Respondent conditioning, on the other hand, is about learning through association. Like when we associate a particular sound with something pleasant or unpleasant.
So these learning processes, they're like the software that runs on the hardware of our genes. They allow us to navigate the world around us. And that's at the heart of ABA, isn't it?
Absolutely. Now, I want to take things a step further and delve into, it's a new and exciting area of research. Epigenetics. Think of epigenetics as adding a layer of control on top of our genes. It doesn't actually change the DNA sequence itself, but it influences how those genes are expressed.
So like a volume control knob for our genes. You can turn them up or down without changing the underlying song.
I love that. That's a great way to put it. To illustrate this, let's look at this groundbreaking study on Carpenter ants.
Okay.
In these colonies, you've got two main castes, minors, who are the foragers, and majors, the soldiers.
So they have totally different roles.
Yes.
Even though they're all sisters with the same genes. Fascinating.
It is. And researchers found that they could actually switch the roles of these ants just by manipulating their epigenetic markers, those chemical tags that control gene expression. The majors, they started acting like minors, foraging for food, and vice versa.
Wow. So it's like they reprogram their behavior just by tweaking those epigenetic settings.
Yeah.
Mind-blowing.
It really is. And this has huge implications for ABA because it suggests that even seemingly innate behaviors might be more malleable than we once thought.
Wow, that opens up so many possibilities. So we've covered a lot of ground, from natural selection to the fascinating world of epigenetics.
Now that we've explored those foundations of selection by consequences at that evolutionary level, let's zoom in a little. Let's see how this process kind of unfolds throughout an individual's lifetime. We call this level 2, behavioral selection by reinforcement.
So if level 1 is about, which genes get passed down over generations, level 2 is about, which behaviors get repeated within an individual's lifetime.
Exactly. It's about how those consequences, they shape our actions. They lead us to repeat the behaviors that give us favorable outcomes and avoid those that, those that lead to less desirable ones.
So it's this constant learning process, kind of refining our behavior based on our experiences.
Exactly.
It's like we're constantly shaping and being shaped by the feedback we get from our environment. If it works, we're likely to do it again. If it doesn't, we try something else.
That's a great way to put it. And this process, it operates on multiple levels, from the very basic to the incredibly complex. Let's go back to our friend Aplysia, the marine snail. Remember how we talked about how researchers could trigger that complex egg-laying sequence by, directly manipulating its genes?
Yeah, that was pretty amazing. It showed how those genes can orchestrate some pretty complex behaviors.
Well, in another study, they were able to increase biting behavior in Aplysia. They did it by stimulating the neural pathways, the ones associated with feeding, but there wasn't any food present.
Wait, so they tricked the snail's brain into thinking it was eating, and that made it bite more. So even at the neural level, consequences, or I guess the perception of consequences, can drive behavior?
Exactly. This just shows you how powerful these principles of reinforcement can be. Now, what happens when a behavior that used to produce a favorable outcome, it stops working? That's where extinction comes in.
Right, when a behavior no longer leads to the consequence that you want, it gradually decreases. It's like that vending machine that used to give you your favorite snack, and then all of a sudden it just stops working.
Yeah.
You might try a few more times, but eventually you just got to give up and move on.
Exactly. But here's the thing about extinction. It can be a catalyst for creativity. When those old, reliable behaviors stop working, well, we're forced to explore new possibilities. We got to try different things until we find something that works.
It's like Thomas Edison and that light bulb. He went through thousands of failed attempts before finding the right filament. If he gave up after the first few failures, who knows, we might still be in the dark ages.
That's a perfect example. Extinction can push us out of our comfort zone, lead to some really innovative solutions. Now, we've been talking about how this reinforcement shapes individual behaviors, but how does this connect to the bigger picture of evolution? How did something as complex as human language even come about?
That's a great question. It's mind-boggling to think that something so nuanced, so essential as language, could have emerged from these basic principles of reinforcement and selection.
It is. To understand this, we need to look at the evolution of social signaling. You see, vocal sounds, well, they offer some distinct advantages over gestures. They work in the dark, around corners, even when your hands are busy doing other things.
That makes sense. And we have a really fantastic example of this. Silbo, a whistled language, spoken on this island, La Gomera. It has really rugged terrain, making it tough to communicate over long distances. So the inhabitants, they developed this amazing whistled language that could carry across those valleys and ravines.
It's an incredible example of how environmental pressures can shape the evolution of these communication systems. And it highlights the idea that verbal behavior, just like any other behavior, it's subject to these principles of selection by consequences.
So those whistles that were most effective at conveying meaning across those distances, they were the ones that got repeated, refined over generations. It's like natural selection acting on language itself.
Exactly. And human language, it likely evolved through a similar process, with a combination of gestures, vocal sounds, gradually being shaped by those responses of listeners.
That makes me think about reinforcement in language development, especially for those individuals we work with in ABA. If we want to help them develop strong communication skills, well, we need to provide that consistent reinforcement for their attempts at communication, no matter how small or unconventional they might seem.
Absolutely. Every successful interaction, every instance of understanding and being understood, those all act as reinforcers, and it strengthens those communication pathways. Now let's zoom out even further, explore level 3, cultural selection. This level, it focuses on how selection by consequences operates at the level of, well, entire groups and societies.
Okay, so now we're talking about the big picture, how societies kind of evolve and adapt over time.
Precisely. And this level, it builds upon the previous two. So cultural practices, they emerge from those behaviors of individuals, which are themselves, of course, shaped by genes and reinforcement history. But at this level, that unit of selection, it's not an individual behavior, it's a cultural practice. It's a customary way of doing things within a group.
So things like traditions, customs, beliefs, values, those shared ways of doing things that really define a culture.
Exactly. Think about something as basic as dining customs. Some cultures use chopsticks, others use forks, some eat with their hands. These practices didn't just appear out of thin air, they evolved over time. They were influenced by factors like available resources, social norms, and the consequences of those practices for the group.
Makes me think that some of our seemingly arbitrary social customs probably have their roots in some long-forgotten environmental conditions or historical contingencies.
That's a great point. And just like individual behaviors, cultural practices are selected for their consequences. We call this relationship between a practice and its effects on the group metacontingencies.
So if a cultural practice benefits the group in some way, it's more likely to be maintained and passed down through generations.
Exactly. And if it has negative consequences for the group, well, it's more likely to be, modified or just completely abandoned. Here's a fascinating example. Researchers were studying a troop of baboons, and they taught them to avoid eating bananas. They did this by spraying them with water whenever they got near the bananas.
But I bet there's a twist here.
You bet there is. Even after they stopped the water spraying, those baboons, they continued to avoid the bananas. They had developed this culturally transmitted food taboo.
So even though that original contingency was gone, the behavior persisted because it had become a social norm, kind of like a rule that everyone in the group follows.
Precisely. And this just shows how these cultural practices can take on a life of their own influencing behavior even when the original reasons for those practices are no longer relevant.
That's incredible. It makes you think about all those unwritten rules we follow in our own lives and how those rules might have originated from some long-forgotten contingency. But understanding this, well, this can be really helpful in ABA, especially when working with individuals from different cultural backgrounds.
Absolutely. We need to be sensitive to that cultural context of the behaviors that we're observing, and avoid imposing our own cultural biases on our interpretations.
That's a really important point. Now, this brings us to a concept that's relevant to both individual behavior and cultural practices, the tragedy of the commons. It's this idea that when individuals act in their own self-interest, it can sometimes lead to the depletion of a shared resource, ultimately harming everyone.
Right. A classic example, overfishing. Each fisherman, they want to catch as many fish as possible to maximize their profits. But if everyone does this, the fish population collapses and everyone loses out in the long run.
So it's this clash between short-term individual gain and long-term collective well-being. And sadly, we see this play out in all sorts of scenarios, environmental issues, social dilemmas.
Exactly. And this is where ABA can play a really important role. You see, by understanding these principles of selection by consequences at all three levels, evolution, individual behavior, and culture, well, we can design interventions that promote cooperation, sustainability, and ultimately a better world for everyone.
It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected, and our actions, they have these ripple effects that extend far beyond ourselves.
Absolutely. Now, before we move on to that final part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this question. How might understanding the tragedy of the commons inform your work in ABA? What strategies can you use to promote cooperation and shared benefits in the individuals and groups you work with?
So as a quick recap for our listeners, let's revisit those three levels. Level 1, evolution and natural selection, showed us how those traits that give organisms a survival advantage are more likely to be passed down. Think dinosaurs versus those mammals after the asteroid. Survival of the fittest.
Right. At level 2, behavioral selection by reinforcement, we saw how those consequences shape an individual's behavior. Behaviors that lead to, well, good stuff, they get repeated and the others fade away.
And remember, Aplysia, that little snail. Turns out, even those simple creatures can learn through those basic principles of operant conditioning. Those changes, they're happening at the neural level, folks.
And then level 3, cultural selection, that broadened our perspective to see how societies, how they're shaped by the consequences of their practices. If a cultural practice benefits the group, well, it's more likely to stick around. Like think chopsticks versus forks, or those food taboos, and even the tragedy of the commons.
So we've covered a lot, but what does it all mean for you, our amazing ABA professionals? How can you apply this in your work? What are the takeaways here?
Well, this framework, it gives us this powerful lens to understand the individuals we work with, their behaviors, and the environments that shape them. It reminds us that behavior, well, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's always a context, a history, a set of consequences that are influencing those behaviors.
It's like putting together a puzzle. By understanding these levels of selection, we can see how those pieces fit together, how everything from genes to culture can all contribute to behavior.
Exactly. We can analyze those contingencies that are maintaining a behavior, consider the learning history, and even those broader cultural influences. This allows us to move beyond just treating symptoms and get to the root of the issue.
So we can be more like detectives, uncovering the clues that explain why a behavior is happening, and then using that info to develop effective interventions.
And by understanding how that reinforcement works, both positive and negative, we can design interventions that create lasting change. We become architects of behavior, shaping it in positive direction.
It's empowering to think that we can use these principles to help people learn new skills, overcome challenges, reach their full potential.
Absolutely. And this framework, it can even help us advocate for those broader changes, addressing those tragedy of the commons scenarios. We can promote cooperation, sustainability, create those environments that support positive behavior for everyone.
It's about recognizing that connection we all share, and that our actions have consequences, not just for us, but for those around us, and even future generations. You, as ABA professionals, have this opportunity to make a difference, using these principles to promote positive change at every level.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into selection by consequences, we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, see them in action in your work, and use them to create a more positive and enriching world.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.